So, well, that's where... hands up for a start. How many contractors in the room, main contractors? Hands up. Quite a lot. That's really good.
They're not going to enjoy my talk.
Subcontractors? Subcontractors, relatively few. But that's a really good showing for contractors, actually. It's quite unusual at a conference like this. So what Barry had tried to get was to try and have something to try and get us to talk about the contractor's view of some of the NEC stuff. Obviously, the project manager is there as well, as we've just heard from Sarah. How to survive the contracts jungle.
Oh, that's my bit.
That's your bit? Yeah. That's all right then, we'll carry on.
Right, good afternoon.
I'll just step back.
You'll soon realise that my part in the duet was to provide the backing vocals, but I've been projected into the limelight, and really I wanted to give a talk from the perspective of a subcontractor under the NEC contract. One, because as you probably guessed, I do most of my work for subcontractors. Two, because I think, as I said, that subcontractors are definitely underrepresented at these sort of events. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, because I read a book in the 90s, some of you might have read this, although a lot of you won't be old enough to remember it, called the Streetwise Subbie. It was written by a guy called John Russell, who liked to go under the name of Jack Russell, because he could then call himself the Contractual Terrier. And his mission in life was to champion the cause of subcontractors, who were always ending up in disaster on main contracts. It's a sad thing, really, that not a lot has changed, unfortunately. But now, which button is it to move on?
Just right one. Don't press that. Don't press that one. That one. Go.
I'll settle down.
You just shout at me.
Right.
I'll press the buttons. I'll just do the buttons.
Now, what Jack used to say was that if you listen to the chattering classes, as he used to call them in the industry, you could be forgiven for thinking that we've entered a brave new world in contracting. This brave new world doesn't have things like confrontation and claims and the odd punch-up. Instead, we live in the day where the main contractor's door is always open, everyone's a team player, and collaboration is very much the buzz phrase. But I'm afraid that's not my experience, and that's not the fault of the NEC. I actually think we're worse at delivering projects now than when Jack wrote his first book. And why is that? Well, the modern role of the main contractor, and don't run away with the idea, given that there's so many of you, that, that I'm putting the boot into the main contractors. I admire anybody that takes on the risks and responsibilities that they take on for a meagre 2 or 3%. But unfortunately, the life of the modern main contractor these days, he's very much a knowledge worker. He fills his team with people who should be good at planning, procuring, contract administration, managing interfaces, and all that stuff. The point I'm making is he doesn't do much actual physical work these days, and that's not a criticism. It's the world we live in. The people that do the physical work these days, of course, are the technical and specialist subcontractors. Now, the technical and specialist subcontractor, he's a very simple sort of individual, technically brilliant in his own field, but really just wants to be allowed to get on with the job and not be messed around. And this would work fine if the main contractor was good at all those things that he's responsible for. Emphasis being on planning and managing interfaces. It's my experience that today, very often, projects fail because the main contractor has not got to grips with the planning and the management of interfaces. Anyway, on that note, we'll move on.
Move on.
Yep. What Jack Russell did, he hadn't discovered the NEC when he wrote the second edition of that book I just showed you. He hadn't discovered the NEC, but he would have loved the NEC because he sets down some principles that I think are just as relevant today, whether you're on an NEC or any other form of contract, that he maintained would help the subcontractor survive in what he called the contract's jungle. And these are the 5 things that he talked about and that I really wanted to elaborate on, but with a bit of an NEC twist. He said it was very important to establish a clear baseline at the outset. Stay commercially and contractually aware once the job commences. Don't be shy, get noticed, be proactive, and maintain protection at all times. Now, before really we get into Jack's tips, there is a question, and I think Sarah touched on it. You may want to ask yourself when that inquiry comes through the door and everyone's excited, is it worth the risk? I see a lot of inquiry documents these days where, although it's an NEC contract, there's been an awful lot of changes made by the main contractor and the inclusion of some of what I call suicide terms, suicide from the subcontractor's perspective. You all know what I'm talking about, deletion of certain compensation events, extended periods for the release of retention. The ground worker normally won't get his retention released until the end of the main contractor's job, even though he finishes at month 3. Suicide terms like the subcontractor shall undertake the work in accordance with the main contractor's progress, excessive delayed damages, and in some cases delayed damages at large. So the first question before we really get into the tips should be, is it worth the risk? Construction, like many other areas of life, is an exercise in weighing up the risks and the rewards. And if you do that exercise and decide it's just not worth the risk, then probably stay away from it altogether. But let's assume now that we've reached the stage where we're deciding to take on the contract. I won't get involved with an NEC contract for a subcontractor today unless I'm there at the start. I don't want to be picking up an NEC contract that's got all the commercial percentages wrong, didn't have a program bound into the subcontract. I can't be bothered with all that stuff. So I put a huge amount of effort into establishing a clear baseline from the very start. Now, what I mean by a clear baseline, and you've got to remember there's sometimes a very long time between receiving the tender inquiry and actually getting the contract awarded. I put a huge amount of effort into making sure that the scope at the point that the contract is signed is actually what we priced for when we submitted the tender. You'd be amazed at how many twists and turns there are from the point that the tender goes in via, even before that, tender amendments, negotiations during the tender period. And very often when the subcontractor gets given the subcontract to execute, it bears very little resemblance to actually what he priced in the first place. So huge amount of effort to be put into making sure that the scope is the scope that was priced, which is of course all laid down in something the NEC calls the subcontract works information. The programme, if there's one bit of advice I never fail to give a subcontractor these days, is strive to get a first programme referred to in the contract. If that programme isn't included in the contract, then the baseline in terms of programme is not set. And in fact, I see things these days, and you must all see them. Contractors will try and avoid giving you dates in a subcontract as to when they're going to release the site. They prefer to refer to something called a notice to proceed. And the words, normally amended from NEC, will say something like, the subcontractor shall commence the works on site within 2 weeks of the notice to proceed. Well, of course, that means he doesn't really know when he's going to give you that notice and when you're going to be asked to start work on site. Sorry, right, staying contractually and commercially aware. This starts really before the order is signed. 2 important things for a subcontractor: cash flow and the financial return on compensation events. Cash flow, as someone once said, is the lifeblood of contractors. Well, you can apply that to subcontractors just as easily. Given that very few main contractors are willing to trust a subcontractor with a target contract, heaven forbid not a cost reimbursable contract, most subcontractors are let on an option A if you're using the full NEC subcontract, or well, the short form of subcontract is basically a fixed price or remeasured contract. But the point I'm making is, in order to protect your cash flow, a subcontractor should give an immense amount of thought to the preparation of the activity schedule, or alternatively, if it's the short form, the price list. Because we're not in the days of the old bill of quantities. I don't think anybody knows how to prepare one these days. We're not in that world where you get paid under an NEC, unless it's option B, and that's quite unusual. We're not in the world these days where you get paid for the quantity of work you're doing at interim periods. You get paid based on either activities completed or if it's a price list, items of work completed. So don't, for heaven's sake, have activities that are going to take 10 weeks in your activity schedule, because you simply won't get the money for those activities until that activity is completed. I'm teaching a lot of people to suck eggs, but you'd be amazed at how many people don't appreciate that. The other thing you need to be very conscious of before you sign that contract is what I call the commercial percentages. The commercial percentages determine how much you earn or what the return is on any compensation events that arise. Funny story, I was called in, and there's someone I can blame for this, I can't see if he's in the audience. I was called to a job up on the A46 up near Grantham. And I walked through the door with my happy to help badge on, and the first thing the project manager said was, Mike, you've got to get me out of this contract. Basically, it was a landscaping contract. He'd signed up to a landscaping subcontract. He'd spent 2 years planting out the batters on this new road on the A46, and he was now about to go into a 6-year maintenance period, and all of that was captured under a single NEC contract. He'd lost a fortune doing the planting, and he wasn't prepared to lose any more money during this 6-year maintenance season. So the first thing he said to me, Mike, you've got to get me out of this contract. Now that's an unusual remit for me, because it's not often you get asked to do that. Unfortunately, it was never going to be that simple. But when I looked behind the reasons why he'd lost so much money, we had a quick look in the contract data, and the fee percentage has been entered at 0%. Now, you shake your heads, and even I did, because I can't imagine how anyone could possibly put 0% if they understand what that fee percentage is deemed to cover. But there it was. So that guy was effectively working for free whenever compensation events came along. And it was unfortunate that a contract that started out at 1.2 million ended up at, will end up at about 2.5 million. So he'll be doing a lot of work for free. Fortunately, he did put something in for what was the people overheads, but that was only 4%, so that didn't really help a great deal. So you've got to get you've got to understand what those commercial percentages mean, and you've got to make sure the correct numbers are put in.
I'll just chip in a couple of points there. One thing you mentioned in passing, the short contract. People see that quite often the client prepares the price list, and a lot of tenderers don't realise that that is all they're going to get paid. So it's like an activity schedule. If there's not a quantity for something, then you still got to do the work, but you're not going to get paid for it. A lot of people, I find a lot of subcontractors particularly don't recognise that.
It's quite an elegant little. I do a lot of work on the short contract.
It's great in principle, but as long as both parties realise that.
Yeah, that's right. And staying commercially and contractually aware throughout the contract, well, that goes without saying. I'm a great fan of systems. Some of you would have heard of these things called CAMS, Contract Administration Systems. ASITE is one of them. Lawrence will know about ASITE. They're good systems because they save you the trouble of actually developing your own templates for things like early warnings, compensation event notices. Problem with the system, of course, it doesn't tell you when to put the notices in. So you need good staff to know when those communications need to be entered on these administration systems. I'm blessed, and that isn't too strong a word, on one of the jobs just down the road from me, in that I've got a site team, an operational team, who know when they need to tell me about things that they believe isn't going to plan. In fact, one of the questions I always ask them, or tell them to ask themselves, is this what we priced to do? Because as Jack used to say, sometimes when you're up to your backside in alligators, it's very difficult that you only went in to drain the swamp and not dredge the Zambezi. So I educate, one of the first things I do is educate the team, that are the operational team, to alert me to things that I need to know about. This is another example. In fact, when Glenn was busy texting me this morning, saying, where the hell are you? I was sitting in a meeting down the road, listening to a situation where, due to the main contractor's desire to get the platform stairs installed, he'd cleared out everybody from the 5th floor basement level to allow these stairs to be installed. Now, what that meant for us, we were supposed to be laying blocks, but unfortunately we couldn't put our block cutting machine down at the basement level. So every single block that had to be cut was having to be carried manually up 5 stories to be cut and then carried down. And that's just an example of, did we really see this job and price it like that? Next one.
As you just said.
Yeah, I've just talked about the alligators. Don't be shy, get noticed. The NEC places a huge amount of emphasis on good communication. And therefore it's imperative that you put those notices in that the NEC, and you make those communications that the NEC requires of you. You can get criticised. Some main contractors will say, oh, you're not being a team player, aren't you getting a bit too contractual with that? But to be clear about this, the contract demands you to put those notices in. And the main contractor very often will be very quick later on to tell you that you're not entitled to something because you didn't put in the proper notices. So don't be shy, get noticed. Now, if there's one word that really sums up the whole philosophy of the NEC, I guess it's proactiveness. Be proactive, but obviously not at your own expense. I always tell the subbies that I work for that you're going to make my life a lot easier if you demonstrate a good attitude, you're proactive, and basically don't be negative when the contractor asks you to do something. We've turned into what I like to call the general works contractor. Things have gone so badly on one of these jobs that I'm on that we've got very little contract work left to do. All we do is fetch and carry for other contractors whose works are on the critical path these days. But that's not a problem as long as we're getting adequately compensated for doing that.
Yeah.
I'm going a bit off message here, but it doesn't matter.
No, it's fine. Carry on.
There's another one, yeah. This isn't so important today with the NEC. It was in Jack's time when he lived in the days of the global claim at the end and nobody sending in the right notices. He used to emphasise the importance of having good records, and one of his famous sayings was that if I had to choose, give me a good set of site records in preference to the expensive services of a lawyer or claims consultant, I would add to that. And that is still true. I know the NEC, in encouraging proactivity, looks for you to submit quotations based on forecasts. So maybe the emphasis on maintaining site records is not what it used to be, but I would still feel much more comfortable when I go onto a job where the subcontractor has actually maintained good site records. Getting a good site diary out of a site team these days is quite a difficult problem. A site diary that doesn't just say that, sun was shining, Joe didn't turn up for work. That's useless. They need educating us to what needs to go into a site diary. I think I'll round my little piece off because you've got to remember I was only here to do 10 or 15 minutes and Richard will fill in the rest. But when I decided I was going to base this talk on that book, the Streetwise Subbie, I thought, having done a few notes, that I'd check if he'd written a later edition. And lo and behold,
Yes.
in 2007 he wrote his third edition, and that one actually had 2 chapters devoted to the NEC. And remember I said that if Jack had known about the NEC he would have loved it. Well, he obviously did find out about it quite late in life,
Loved it.
and he included 2 chapters, and I'll tell you what they were called. It's quite amusing. He called those 2 chapters Have You Met the NEC Contract and NEC Problems and Pitfalls, which might suggest that he wasn't a big supporter of the NEC. But nothing could be further from the truth, because I'm going to quote you now from his conclusion. All in all, I would advise the subcontractor to approach and conduct the NEC contract with very careful preparation, appropriate tender allowances for conformance, and what that means is that put the right number of people on to make sure that you're complying with the administrative demands of the subcontract. Make sure you allow for an enlarged job staff. Clearly, if you're going to be dealing with issues contemporaneously, you need a bigger set of people on the job at the time than if you're going to be dealing with things later on. A proactive attitude which reflects the NEC philosophy. Won't go off much longer. Pre-contract training of all technical, supervisory and administrative personnel and diligent adherence to the rules and time limits. If the correct approach is adopted and the rules closely adhered to, then the NEC contract has a great deal to offer all concerned. So I was quite pleased that Jack, who I knew would always love the NEC, eventually wrote a book after he discovered it and is actually singing its praises from a subcontractor's perspective.
Has anybody else seen anything written about the NEC from a subcontractor's perspective? Don't all shout at once.
See, what I'm going to do, I'm going to write
I think
an
you should
NEC
get
version
some credits on that. Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know Jack Russell. I'm not here to promote his book. In fact,
You've done it very well, hasn't he?
he and I would not have got on. He was a great lover of country music, as you can tell by lots of quotes from the likes of Perry Como, Tammy Wynette, and Kenny Rogers. Mine would be filled with more soul music quotes. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I try to make it a little bit amusing, but I do think that the subbies are underrepresented, and given the disasters that befall many of them, I can't understand why there's so few of them in the audience today. Thank you.
Interesting. I'm not sure I can or should try and follow that, but I'll have a quick through, if anything, any half-decent slides that Barry had for us.
Or you can just speak yourself.
Or I can just see how we go, yeah. What I would say is that I remember 10 years ago, some of the main contractors still seeing their job as subby bashing. I don't know, I hope that's gone out of the industry, but I don't think it has. It would be interesting to do some stats, because all this stuff about target cost and collaboration, what percentage of the construction industry spend on NEC jobs goes through option A lump sum subcontracts? Must be huge, mustn't it? It must be absolutely huge. And yet they're the guys that aren't getting trained, aren't being able to do stuff properly, and therefore are getting bashed. And that's something that maybe we as a quotes community ought to try and do something about. Now this is where I've got no idea what I'm doing with the slides here, so here we go. Who's got issues with NEC3? Have we got any hands up? Your straw posts, get these reds and greens. Give us a red if you've had problems with payment. That's everybody, isn't it? Is that everybody? I think that's everybody. Disallowed, it's not going to, we've all done it. This is what causes the grief, and this is why we have training to try and help you people do this. There's a shed load of training out there. I spend most of my life personally doing training, and what's really sweet, I wasn't expecting to talk today, but I came along and Barry's put this slide in, now, which is just quite nice. I saw somebody refer to this on the LinkedIn group as the Patterson mantra, I think. This is a slide that I use in all my training. 10.1, there's all sorts of articles on 10.1. This man Neil's wrote a really good article on 10.1 just quite recently. But as a flip chart summary, shall act as stated in the contract. That's the bottom line. Do what it says in the chuffing contract. To be able to do that, you've got to read the chuffing contract. End of story. Unfortunately, what Barry hasn't put on the slide is my interpretation of "and in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation," which is _ TTEO, chuffing talk to each other. You've got to chuffing talk to each other. You've got to read the contracts, know what you've got to do. You've got to chuffing talk to each other before you press the button, but then you've got to do what it says in the contract. And we've heard lots of talk about like this man here is very, very keen on in the cloud contract management systems. I'm a huge fan, but a danger of those, it makes so easy to make communications that people don't bother talking to each other. That's something we need to try and change in the industry. So the third line, I probably the most important one, is chuffing talk to each other. How many clauses in the NEC actually require you to talk to each other? Anybody know that one? John's going for 2, because John's sad, he knows the NEC inside out. 20.4, you've got to be in consultation, you come up with a cost forecast. 62.1, you've got to discuss before you ask for alternative quotations. Everything else, you don't have to talk to each other. I don't think so. You've got to talk to each other. I found one the other day, actually. In the programme, the contractor can only put agreed activities of the employer. But it doesn't say how or when those are agreed. So maybe they've got to talk to each other before they put them on the programme. Simple line, talk to each other. Reachback. Was that a prompt for Reachback? Possibly. At all. I've got no idea. This is somebody else's slides. Move on. I'm doing what I can, guys. And Glenn said you've only got 5 minutes, so I'll do what I can. So, myths, option C, payment stops at completion. Oh, no, it doesn't. It carries on every month right through to the end of the defect certificate. Disallowed cost only, rubbish. Defects only have to be notified, rubbish. They can get notified all the way through to the defect state, as we know. Option A, as our man has told us, Mike's told us, we can't get paid on part activities. And option C, we have to be bloody good at forecasting costs. I've got a whole team of people from Mott's helping Cumbria County Council. Most of that is option E, because it was mad panic, basically repair Cumbria. Option E contracts. Oh, it was. That was the works information. Repair Cumbria. And guess what? It's quite difficult to do proper cost forecast for that, but they're getting better. Oh, look at that. What can we do to improve the commercial aspects of NEC contracts? So I can throw out some one-liners. What can we do to improve them? Sorry? The T word, training. That would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah? Interesting. Am I allowed to ask how many people here are accredited ECC project managers? Hands up. Good. Was it worth doing? The right answer. Brilliant. Good line. I wasn't plugging for that one, honestly. But if you're spending or looking after the spending of millions of pounds of somebody's money, you need to know this contract inside out. Not just an overview and a rough idea, its compensations and programs important. You need to know it inside out. Invest in yourself, get your client, your people, your employers to invest in you, and learn it properly. And Barry's going to leave it there. Thank you. That was Barry Trebes in passing.